It was a chilly Friday night, and I found myself walking into that old, dimly lit bar where everything once felt familiar. Memories of laughter and late-night conversations with someone who was no longer part of my life lingered in the air. Nostalgia pulled me back, and as I stepped in, the faint hum of a jukebox playing a melancholic tune made me pause. The table where we'd spent hours playing pool stood untouched, bathed in the glow of a flickering neon sign. True, scary stories about bars never felt real until that night. Something in the atmosphere shifted, a creeping unease settling in my chest. As I chalked the pool cue and lined up my shot, a man approached. His demeanor was casual at first, but his eyes carried an unsettling intensity. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice low yet sharp enough to cut through the music. I politely declined, hoping he'd lose interest, but he lingered, his gaze heavy. My heart raced slightly, an inexplicable sense of foreboding wrapping around me. Real horror stories often began innocuously, just like this. I focused on the game, pretending not to notice his persistent presence. Minutes passed, and his polite veneer began to crack. He offered to buy me a drink, but I declined again, feeling his frustration radiate like static electricity. His tone shifted, becoming sharper, more insistent. I excused myself and moved toward the bar, but he followed. "Why the cold shoulder?" he sneered, his words laced with venom. The bartender, catching my discomfort, shot me a knowing look and positioned himself nearby. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd stepped into one of those creepy true stories you hear about, but never expect to live. The man's persistence escalated into hostility. When I ignored him for the final time, he grabbed my bag and stormed out of the bar. Shocked and frozen for a moment, I quickly followed to retrieve my belongings, only to find him smirking in the parking lot. "Looking for this?" he taunted, tossing the bag just out of reach. As I bent to pick it up, he vanished into the night. Relief flooded me momentarily, but it was fleeting. Little did I know my ordeal was far from over. Hours later, back at home, my phone buzzed with an unknown notification. It was a tracking alert. Panic set in as I realized that my bag contained an AirTag, and he must have activated it. My mind raced as I checked every window and door. True ghost stories suddenly seemed less terrifying than the very real horror unfolding in front of me. I was being watched, tracked, hunted. The faint sound of footsteps outside my window confirmed my worst fears. He was nearby. For the next few nights, I barely slept. Each creak of the floorboards, every shadow cast by streetlights sent my heart into overdrive. On the third night, I saw him. He stood across the street, a silhouette illuminated by the glow of a lamppost, holding something that glinted menacingly, a knife. Real-life horror was staring me in the face, and I could feel its icy grip on my throat. My instinct screamed to call the police, but I hesitated, paralyzed by fear. What if he vanished before they arrived? The following day, I took drastic measures. I changed my locks, installed cameras, and stayed with a friend. Yet, the unease lingered. Each notification on my phone sent shivers down my spine, and every corner I turned, I expected to see his face. Haunted places weren't confined to dilapidated buildings. Sometimes your own home became one. The sense of violation was overwhelming, a reminder of how vulnerable we truly are in the face of evil. I began piecing together his motives, analyzing every interaction. Was he just an unhinged individual, or was there something more sinister at play? Stories of unsolved mysteries and supernatural encounters came to mind, and I wondered if his presence was more than physical. Late one night I heard whispers, soft, chilling and unintelligible, echoing through my apartment. My blood ran cold as I realized the knife he'd held wasn't the only weapon he wielded. Something darker was at work. Weeks passed, and his appearances became sporadic, yet equally haunting. The AirTag stopped transmitting, but the fear didn't dissipate. Friends began sharing eerie true events from their lives, trying to comfort me or perhaps warn me. Their accounts blurred the line between real-life hauntings and paranoia. As the days dragged on, I started questioning my own reality. Was he still out there, or had I conjured up a monster of my own design? One final incident cemented my fear. Late one night, I woke up to the sound of breaking glass. My heart pounded as I grabbed my phone to dial 911. Before I could, the lights flickered and a cold draft swept through the room. Footsteps echoed down the hall, stopping just outside my door. A sense of dread unlike any other washed over me. Then silence. It was the kind of bone-chilling true story people tell around campfires, but this time it was happening to me, and I knew deep down it wasn't over. It was a quiet Tuesday night at the bar, the kind of night where time crawls and the sound of clinking glasses echoes like distant whispers. I had just started my shift, wiping down the counter, when he walked in. His presence was unnerving from the start. Broad-shouldered, wearing a weathered jacket and a face obscured by the shadow of a worn cap. "Kevin, right?" he asked, his voice calm but cold. I nodded, unsure of how he knew my name. He leaned in, his piercing gaze locking onto mine, and said something I'll never forget. "You've wronged someone, and I'm here to balance the scales." At first I thought it was a prank, a joke by one of the regulars trying to add some excitement to an otherwise dull evening. But his tone carried no hint of humor. "I think you've got the wrong guy," I said, forcing a laugh. The man didn't budge, his eyes narrowing as if dissecting my very soul. True scary stories often start with a moment like this, where unease slowly takes root. "You'll remember," he muttered cryptically before ordering a whiskey neat. He didn't drink it. He just sat there staring at me, his silence heavier than the thickest fog. As the night dragged on, he remained seated, his presence casting a shadow over the room. Customers came and went, their chatter unable to drown out the tension. Every so often he'd glance at me, his expression unreadable but undeniably threatening. Real horror stories from bartenders often include strange patrons, but this was different. This wasn't just eerie, it was deeply personal. "What do you want from me?" I finally asked. Voice pitching anxiety, he smirked, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the counter. "You'll see," he replied, leaving behind a chill that clung to the air. When my shift ended, I breathed a sigh of relief. The man had left without another word, and I convinced myself it was over. As I locked the bar's doors and stepped outside, the crisp night air felt refreshing until I noticed him standing across the street. His silhouette under the dim streetlight was as still as a statue. The thought of real-life horror suddenly became more than a distant idea. It was my reality. My hands trembled as I fumbled for my keys, rushing to get into my car. I told myself he wouldn't follow, but deep down, I knew better. That night, I awoke to the sound of creaking floorboards in my apartment. My heart raced as I lay in the darkness, straining to hear more. The city was quiet, but the subtle shifts in the air told me I wasn't alone. Grabbing a baseball bat from beside my bed, I crept toward the living room. My pulse pounded in my ears as I rounded the corner and froze. There he was, seated calmly on my couch, holding a knife that gleamed in the faint light filtering through the blinds. "You need to listen, Kevin," he said, his voice disturbingly calm. I stammered, demanding to know how he'd entered. "The locks are weak," he replied, as if critiquing my home security was a normal thing to do. He didn't move, didn't lunge. He just sat there, as though he belonged. "You think your actions don't have consequences?" he asked, his words sharp enough to draw blood. Supernatural encounters came to mind. Could this man be more than human? His presence felt heavier than the room itself, as if he were drawing the life out of it. I tried to focus on his words, but all I could see was the knife in his hand. Before I could respond, he stood, placing the knife carefully on the coffee table. "You'll know what you did soon enough," he said, walking toward the door. Panic surged through me. Should I tackle him? Call for help? My body refused to move, paralyzed by the sheer weight of the moment. He opened the door, pausing briefly, to glance back. "Consider this your warning," he said before disappearing into the night. True ghost stories couldn't compare to the terror coursing through me at that moment. I locked every door and window, but it felt futile, like he could return at any time. The following days were a blur of paranoia and sleepless nights. Every sound, every shadow sent my mind spiraling into fear. The knife he'd left behind sat on the table, a grim reminder of his visit. I debated throwing it away, but couldn't bring myself to touch it. Instead, I left it there, as though it were an artifact from some chilling real-life horror experience. Friends told me to report the incident, but what could I say? That a man with no name, no motive, had broken into my home and left without harm. It felt too surreal to be believed. Despite my efforts to move on, his words echoed in my mind. "You'll know what you did." I replayed every interaction, every choice I'd made, searching for a clue. Could this be tied to the bar? To a customer I'd wronged unknowingly? Unsolved mysteries swirled in my thoughts, each more unsettling than the last. Late one night, as I stared at the knife, I noticed something etched into its handle. A single word: retribution. My stomach turned. This wasn't over. It was only beginning. The climax came on a stormy night. Lightning illuminated the room, casting eerie shadows on the walls. A knock at the door sent my heart racing. It wasn't frantic. It was deliberate, purposeful. I didn't answer, but the knocking persisted, each rap louder than the last. Then silence. When I finally mustered the courage to look through the peephole, no one was there. But on the floor lay an envelope. Inside was a note, scrawled in shaky handwriting: "We're not done." The chilling reality of this eerie, true event gripped me. I knew then that my life had forever changed. It was a Friday night like any other, with the bar bustling with laughter, clinking glasses, and the warm hum of conversation. I was tending to my usual duties, keeping an eye on the regulars and making small talk when they walked in. The couple stood out immediately, not because of their age, but because of their unnerving stillness. Dressed in outdated clothes, they moved with a precision that felt almost rehearsed. They sat at the bar without a word, their faces devoid of emotion, as if carved from stone. I've heard creepy true stories about strange encounters, but seeing this pair sent a shiver down my spine. Their presence was unnervingly quiet, a stark contrast to the lively atmosphere around them. They ordered nothing, simply sitting side by side, their hands clasped on the counter. Every attempt to engage them was met with silence, their eyes staring straight ahead. The other patrons seemed oblivious to their strangeness, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. Real-life hauntings often start with something small, an unexplainable detail that lodges itself in your mind. For me, it was their uncanny synchronization, how they moved in unison, turning their heads at the exact same time, like they were one being split into two. As the hours wore on, the unease grew. The couple never spoke, never touched their phones, never interacted with anyone. It was as if they were frozen in time. At one point, I leaned over to my co-worker and whispered, "What's with them?" He frowned, looking confused. "Who?" he asked. I gestured toward the couple, but his eyes passed over their seats without recognition. My stomach dropped. Haunted places aren't always old, abandoned buildings. Sometimes they're bustling. Bars, hiding sinister mysteries in plain sight. I felt a cold sweat creep down my back as I realized I might be the only one seeing them. Trying to shake off the growing dread, I focused on my tasks, pouring drinks and chatting with customers. But every time I glanced back, they were still there, silent, motionless, their eyes now following me wherever I moved. The woman's gaze in particular was piercing, as if she could see straight into my thoughts. True ghost stories often hinge on a sense of being watched, and in that moment, I felt it more intensely than ever. My hands trembled as I cleaned glasses, the weight of their stares pressing down on me like a physical force. Then as suddenly as they'd appeared, they were gone. I looked up from the counter and their seats were empty. No sound, no movement, just emptiness where they'd been. I rushed to the door, scanning the street, but there was no sign of them. My co-worker asked what was wrong, and I stammered something about needing air. The chilling reality of what had just happened left me questioning my own sanity. Were they real, or had I imagined it? True stories of the unexplained have a way of rooting themselves in your mind, refusing to let go. Later that night, as I locked up, the unease lingered. The street outside was eerily quiet, the usual hum of city life replaced by an unsettling Stillness. That's when I saw them again. The couple stood beneath a flickering streetlight, their faces still devoid of emotion, but this time they were facing me directly. The man raised a hand, his finger pointing toward me, while the woman tilted her head ever so slightly, as if inviting me to come closer. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't just eerie, it was terrifying. I felt rooted to the spot, unable to move. Summoning every ounce of courage, I turned and bolted back into the bar, locking the door behind me. My heart pounded as I peeked through the window, but they were gone, vanished into the night. It reminded me of chilling real-life stories where people encounter something they can't explain, only to have it disappear without a trace. I stayed inside for hours, waiting for dawn, too afraid to step outside. The memory of their hollow eyes and unnerving gestures played on a loop in my mind, leaving me shaken to my core. The next morning, I shared my experience with a few trusted regulars. To my surprise, one of them nodded knowingly. "You're not the first to see them," he said, his tone grave. "That couple has been spotted here for years. People say they died in a car crash nearby, but their spirits never left." Paranormal experiences like this often come with local lore, and hearing it only deepened my fear. Could it be true? Were they ghosts trapped in some endless loop, drawn to the bar for reasons unknown? As days turned into weeks, I began noticing subtle signs that they weren't entirely gone. Glasses would move on their own, chairs would creak when no one was sitting in them, and cold drafts would sweep through the room despite the doors being shut. Customers started reporting strange feelings too, an inexplicable sense of being watched or sudden chills down their spines. True encounters with the paranormal often leave behind these lingering traces, a reminder that the line between our world and theirs is thinner than we think. One night, while closing up, I found something that made my blood run cold, an old photograph. Wedged behind the bar, it was faded and yellowed with age, but the faces were unmistakable. It was the couple, sitting in the very seats they'd occupied that night. My hands shook as I stared at the image, questions swirling in my mind. Who were they? Why did they choose me to see them? And most importantly, would they return? The eerie reality of this true story left me with one unsettling thought. Some mysteries are never meant to be solved.